These are 10 country songs from Nashville in 1993. Most people have forgotten they exist, and the reason they got forgotten tells you something important, not just about country music, but about what that specific year actually was. 1993 was a particular kind of American moment. Bill Clinton had just been sworn in. The World Wide Web existed, but almost nobody used it. There were no streaming platforms, no algorithms deciding what got remembered and what got buried, just radio and tape decks and a country music industry so overloaded with genuine talent that extraordinary songs were getting crowded out by other extraordinary songs. The big hits of that year dominated every format. Garth Brooks was selling records at a scale that did not make sense. Alan Jackson and Brooks and Dunn were all over the Billboard Hot Country Singles chart. George Strait was still the neo-traditional anchor the whole genre orbited around. Underneath all of that, a second layer of music was happening. Songs with no safety net, no social media to give them a second life, no viral moment to pull them back from the edge. If radio did not play them, they were gone. And radio could only play so many songs at once. These are 10 of the ones that got away. They were better than most people realize. Pam Tillis spent most of 1993 releasing music that sounded like it was made by someone who didn't need your approval. One Big Love came from her Homeward Looking Angel album, and it had this open, unhurried quality that felt completely different from the increasingly polished sound already taking over Nashville. She wasn't performing emotion, she was reporting it. The song made a modest run on the Billboard Hot Country Singles chart, and then disappeared. Tillis would go on to have a longer career, but this particular sound, this specific version of her, didn't survive the decade. Hal Ketchum is one of the most underrated figures the 90s produced, and Hearts Are Gonna Roll is part of the reason that is such a strange fact. The song is immaculate. Ketchum had a voice that sounded like it came from somewhere south of sorrow and north of joy, and this track used it perfectly. It got radio time, it had fans, but Ketchum was never quite the right shape for the star machine, and this song now sits in a quiet obscurity that it absolutely does not deserve. Before Martina McBride became the biggest voice in country music, before Independence Day and A Broken Wing, she was a newer artist with a debut album and a very different sound. My Baby Loves Me came from that era, and it had a lightness to it that her later work mostly abandoned. It was joyful in a way that felt almost accidental. Hearing it now is interesting for exactly that reason, because this is the starting line, and most people missed it entirely. Tracy Lawrence never got his full due from mainstream music history, and Alibis is probably the best argument for reconsidering that. Lawrence was on Atlantic Records Nashville at the time, and the song is about the architecture of a lie, the way people build excuses around something they know is wrong. He delivered it with a directness that most artists would have softened. He was competing against names that commanded far more radio support, and he was excellent, and the system was busy. That's how Alibis got lost. It reached number 2 on the Billboard Hot Country Singles chart that year, and somehow still managed to be overlooked in the longer memory of the decade. Confederate Railroad had a run in the early 90s that should have been bigger than it was. Queen of Memphis was their best single, a road-worn barstool piece of storytelling that captured a working-class Southern melancholy the genre was already moving away from. By the mid-90s, country was going slicker and younger and more polished, and Confederate Railroad were too rough around the edges to survive that shift. This song is the document of exactly what got left behind when Nashville decided to clean itself up. Dwight Yoakam was always operating at a slight angle to the mainstream, and his 1993 album, This Time, was the fullest expression of what that meant. 1,000 Miles from Nowhere is a song about dislocation, about being somewhere between where you were and where you're going, not being sure either place still exists. It has a production quality that feels almost cinematic, spare, wide, and slightly lonely. Radio didn't ignore it entirely, but it never got the treatment it deserved. This is a 10 out of 10 country song that most people under 40 have never heard. Mark Chesnutt is criminally underrated, and Almost Goodbye might be the single strongest piece of evidence for that. The song reached #1 on the Billboard Hot Country Singles chart, which should tell you something about its quality, and yet it's almost never discussed when people talk about that era. The song sits in the upper register of what country ballads are capable of, both emotionally and technically. Chesnutt had a voice that could have competed with anyone on the chart that year, and this track proves it. He occupied a lane between the traditional artists and the newer crossover sound, and that lane was always harder to promote. Almost Goodbye got to the top. It deserved a much longer life in the conversation. In 1993, Faith Hill was a debut artist on Warner Brothers Records with a single that sounded like pure, unmediated traditional country. Take Me As I Am, the title track from her debut album of the same name, was her introduction to the world, before the crossover success, before the stadiums, before she became a category rather than just a singer. The song is simple and earnest and completely unguarded. Hearing it now is a little like finding a photograph of someone you know, taken before anything significant happened to them. That rawness never fully came back in her work. This is where she started, and almost nobody remembers it. Vince Gill was at the height of his commercial powers in 1993, the same year he was sweeping the Country Music Association Awards. But No Future in the Past still managed to get overlooked relative to his bigger singles from that period. It's one of the most beautifully constructed country songs the entire decade produced. The melody is restrained and aching, the lyric is precise without being cold, and Jill sings it like he means every word more than he's willing to admit. It sits in his catalog like a quiet room at the end of a long hallway. Most people have walked straight past it without ever looking in. Joe Diffie was on Epic Records. He passed away in 2020. In the weeks after, a lot of people who had not thought about him in years went back and listened. Prop Me Up Beside the Jukebox is the song that brought many of them there, and the reason many of them stayed. It is funny and sad and specific in the way that only the best country songs manage to be. It is the story of a man who decides that if the worst happens, he would rather spend eternity in a honky-tonk than in a cemetery. There is a whole philosophy buried in that joke, a working-class theology of what a good life actually looks like. Joe Diffie understood something the slicker, more polished artists of that era were already starting to lose. This song is the proof. 1993 was the last year country music felt like a place you could walk into rather than a product someone was selling you. The internet was not in your pocket yet. Algorithms were not deciding what got discovered and what disappeared, and radio was still the gatekeeper, which meant it was also the executioner. These 10 songs survived the initial cut, but not the long game. They exist now on old albums and old hard drives and in the memory of people who were paying close attention that year. Most listeners never found them, and that is not a statement about quality. It is a statement about capacity. 1993 had more good music than the system could process. The question worth asking is not why these songs got forgotten. It is what else from that year is still sitting out there somewhere in the dark, waiting for someone to press play. Because that is the thing about 1993. There was so much of it, and most of it is still there.